My first question is really about your approach. Is there a typical approach that you take when identifying topics for research? If you think back over your career and books and articles that you've written, where did those ideas come from? How did they develop? Can you reconstruct that process for us?
Yes, I think that I've always responded uh, first and foremost to concerns about the broader political world that uh, led me to think that there were some understandings out there that might be wrong, needed to be explored, uh, perhaps should be corrected. At the same time, I've also responded to the way that those issues were dealt with in much of the academic literature, especially the political science literature. And if I thought that those issues were not being dealt with well by academics, then it became particularly important for me to make those topics that I would address.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us a few, for instances?
Well, the most prominent example is the uh, uh, book Civic Ideals and the work that led up to it, although there was a similar pattern that led earlier to my dissertation topic. But in the case of Civic Ideals, I was motivated by the fact that in the early 1980s, the election of Reagan signaled dissatisfaction with dominant forms of liberalism descended from the New Deal and Great Society in America, and a resurgence of an emphasis on uh, uh, more traditional American ways of life, American patriotism, and there was a kind of counterpart going on in which, in academic political theory, communitarian critics of liberalism, Michael Walzer, who'd been one of my advisors, Michael Sandel, they prominently put forth more from the left communitarian critiques of liberalism. And there was a related debate in intellectual history led by John Pocock to say that the kinds of accounts I'd been educated in on American political culture emphasizing liberalism missed the importance of early civic Republican conceptions of American national identity and purpose. And Sandel, in particular, wanted to ally his communitarianism with those Republican traditions, while he was certainly not doing it in a way that resembled Ronald Reagan's policy positions. It did represent a similar kind of critique of certain understandings of dominant forms of liberalism. And that really intrigued me. And I tried to think how I could get some empirical purchase on these debates that could illuminate them and perhaps also be useful for thinking normatively about American identity and purposes. And I conceived of the project of studying the history of American citizenship laws because liberalism, as Louis Hartz and other academics defined it, republicanism, as Pocock's and other academics defined it, they had very different conceptions of citizenship, one more individualistic, oriented toward private pursuits, individual rights, another stressing more civic duties and purposes. And I thought looking at the actual history of American citizenship laws could help me see what kinds of positions American governing officials had taken throughout U.S. history. But when I began that work, I saw that there was a lot of official definition of who got to be a citizen, and particularly a citizen with a full set of rights, that invoke different conceptions of citizenship. America as a white man's nation, as a predominantly Christian nation, in ways that didn't have such clear articulation, either in liberalism as Hartz defined it or republicanism as Pocock defined it. There were echoes of those themes in Ronald Reagan's rhetoric, and particularly in some of Ronald Reagan's supporters. And so I came to feel that understanding these aspects of American political culture was particularly important, both to get the historical record right and respond to the academic debates over it, and understand what was happening in America with the Reagan Revolution and the rise of the modern conservative movement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, this is fascinating and very much on point. If I can maybe just abstract a little bit from what you said, you saw a theoretical debate among philosophers and political theorists, and you saw a very kind of a very concrete development in American politics. And you thought, well, there's a history there that needs to be explored. I guess what I like about that is thinking about some empirical work as being theoretically grounded, but obviously very rich and empirical in nature. I'm thinking about this as a model that that others might think of in their own work.
I do think that all our empirical inquiries tacitly presume some kind of larger theoretical position about the way politics works and the way the world works, and that it is useful always to reflect on the relationship of particular empirical inquiries to those larger theoretical pictures, which are always contested and debatable. And at the same time, the reason I am not a quote, pure political theorist is that I've always felt that theoretical debates are best explored in the context of some actual real world political controversies and developments, so that we don't risk pursuing our own imaginations in ways that don't reconnect with actual political experience.
Right. And what I think is really so successful about your work, and maybe something we ought to all aspire to, is it's really this fruitful interchange between moral philosophy and empirical social science, which one doesn't see all that often. I mean, I guess, like many people, I'm a little bit alarmed by how segregated political theory is in the political science discipline.
Well, this has been an issue for the political science discipline ever since the behavioral turn of the 1950s. In 1958, B.O. Key told the association that we were seeing a deepening divide between normative political theory and empirical behavioral work. And he thought they needed each other. I think they need each other. But it's been, I think for understandable reasons, an ongoing challenge to keep them really in productive dialogue with each other.
Mm-hmm. And you also, you have a foot in legal theory and legal philosophy, public law, or whatever term one uses. So I wonder if you can comment a little bit about the role of interdisciplinarity in your research.
Yes, well, I've always been sort of promiscuously interdisciplinary, really just because I always felt not simply entitled, but duty bound to draw on whatever materials and approaches seemed likely to shed light onto the questions I was investigating. And beginning with my dissertation, which was motivated by earlier concerns about American liberalism in the 1970s, when in the Carter years it was undergoing some crisis. At the same time, I was serving as a teaching assistant for Archibald Cox in his American Constitutional Law course at Harvard. And Cox had a view that was influenced by the Harvard wisdom of the day, that the law clearly embodied a fairly unchanging set of understandings that he would have identified as American liberalism. And I felt that wasn't right, that in fact, American political thought had gone through processes of significant development, changed in response to intellectual developments and also social and economic and political developments in the world, and that we ought to teach constitutional law in ways that grasp those changes, and we ought to learn from those changes about the choices we face going forward. So that became the subject of my dissertation, Liberalism in American Constitutional Law, trying to map the changes in American political thought over time as exemplified by constitutional cases. I felt I needed a finite body of evidence that I could explore relatively systematically to show that the changes that I was talking about really were visible across this body of data, if you will. And that meant that I had to plunge into reading legal cases and the law review literature on those cases in considerable depth. Turned out I enjoyed doing so. It also provided me with a kind of more specialized knowledge that has always been a useful window into American politics. And I did ask my thesis supervisor, Judith Sklar, as I made this turn, that, look, if I'm going to be working with legal materials a lot, should I go to law school and get a law school perspective on this? And she said, well, wait till you need to do it to get a job. And so far that hasn't happened yet. So I never went to law school.
Well, let me ask you this. Would you say that there is a consistent theory or theoretical framework behind your work?
I would say that there has been an evolving framework that has some consistent concerns and themes, but I'd like to think that I've learned a bit over the last 40 plus years of doing this work. It is true that, my story is that the experiences of the late 60s and 1970s caused me to question very radically all the political views and larger worldviews that I had been raised in and that I had vigorously advocated for in the 1960s. I was raised a devoutly conservative Protestant Republican, and I came to question all that as a result of the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and more. And so my undergraduate and graduate school years were an active quest to see if I could find a broader framework for understanding the world and understanding politics that I could believe in. And I did come in the course of working on my dissertation to embrace basic understandings expressed in John Locke's theory of the human understanding that I came to blend with a kind of American pragmatist perspective in which, it's well expressed in Quine's web of belief that human knowledge is a matter of having a whole sets of interconnected beliefs, none of which we can be absolutely certain about, but the quest for knowledge involves provisionally taking some beliefs as correct and on the basis of them making inquiries about others. And then you take what you learn from that and you come back and you maybe challenge the premises with which you began, and gradually over time, you develop a deeper understanding of the world. This kind of epistemology was reinforced when I took a course with John Rawls at Harvard. He was very influenced by Quine, and his reflective equilibrium approach reflects that. But in addition to this sort of Enlightenment, empiricist, pragmatist understanding of human knowledge and the way we see the world through the limited but valuable capacities of the human mind, I also came to adopt normative views that represented a version of American democratic liberalism. And that kind of worldview and that kind of political view have shaped my perspective ever since, although my understanding of many of its policy implications have been shaped by discovery of the limitations of those sorts of views and the need to rethink them. So there's been development over time, although I still put myself in those broad camps.
Let me play off a couple of things that you touched on. Do you see your scholarly work as having a sort of a resonance in the political world? Are you engaged politically when you write an academic article or book?
I don't write primarily to influence contemporary politics directly. I don't do that for fundamentally two reasons. I think that my skill set, such as it is better suited to scholarly inquiry than it is to active political advocacy. And the corollary of that is that I don't think I'm particularly good at active, persuasive political advocacy. So that has not been my goal. I don't write academic books with the idea that this will get picked up by contemporary politicians in any direct way. However, when I made the decision to be an academic, and I had been very actively involved in politics through my teens and into my college years, and it was a very conscious choice that I'm not going to be a political activist, I'm going to be a scholar. And I knew that there would be cost to that I would have less opportunity to feel I was having a direct impact on my time. But I felt comfortable with it because my time in different kinds of political work and government jobs had shown me that political actors, governing officials are so caught up in the day-to-day that they often respond by simply reaching out to the environment of ideas around them and pulling out things that they think make sense and they think will be useful to them. And I saw my role as an academic as helping to stock the shelves of that environment of ideas, if that's not mixing metaphors too much, to try to make sure that even though we can't control the uses to which our ideas are put, that when responding to the exigencies of the moment, they reach out for ideas. The ideas that they pull down will be better ideas. And I hoped that by my own scholarly contributions, by the contributions of those I teach, that I could help enrich that environment of ideas and thereby indirectly contribute to better politics. I can't say, looking at the state of the political world today, that I feel entitled to proclaim any great success in this regard. But I think
so. If I could maybe press you a little bit more on this, it does sound like you believe that the academic work that you produce resonates in some way, or may resonate in some way, with policymakers and activists and people who are more directly engaged in politics.
Yes, definitely. I think that we have a responsibility, since we are living in the material world, and there are people who are paying our bills. We have a certain responsibility to do academic work that can reasonably be thought to be of some benefit to those people by helping illuminate their circumstances, their challenges, and alternatives that may be available to them. And I also personally am motivated to do this work, always have been, primarily by concerns about how we can conduct our politics better, how we can use politics to make human lives better, although I'm not without abstract intellectual curiosity, and I certainly find just learning about politics intrinsically fascinating. I've never done it primarily for purposes of intellectual satisfaction. I've always done it because I thought there were real problems in the world that
let's talk more about that, because you've written on this, and I know you feel strongly about it. And but yet there's there's something a little bit perplexing about writing academic work that resonates, because I don't think what you mean is analysis of specific policies, as, let's say, someone at a policy school might do. So where is the sweet spot?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think that scholars need to focus, well, first and foremost, on things that interest them and that they have good reason to think they have some capacity to illuminate. And that's going to be a wide variety of things. So I don't want to sound too prescriptive toward what the wide variety of scholars out there should do. But I think it just makes sense to ask, where is our value added? Where is our comparative advantage? Where can we help provide valuable insights of a sort that otherwise might not come from anywhere? And there are public policy schools, there are think tanks, there are government agencies, there are nonprofits, there are corporate research divisions that explore many aspects of concrete public policies. And if political scientists are interested in doing that, that's fine. I'm not saying they have no role to play, but again, political actors, in my experience, are very focused on the immediate problems of the day. And so they can't think about larger questions of political structures, institutions, and purposes. And so, but nonetheless, they're making decisions that have presumptions about the right answers to all those questions. And I feel that as a scholar, I want to try to address larger questions that are not the direct policy debates of the moment, providing some understandings that we might not otherwise have that can ultimately inform and benefit those policy debates and indeed
do you have a few
struggles.
Books, articles in your head, either yours or written by others that have really, you feel done that well, addressed sort of issues of topical concern, but in a way that would not be possible if you're really caught in the maelstrom of everyday politics?
I think that there's a lot actually, although that the examples that leap to mind that are most influential for me aren't necessarily works of political science, but when I was working on civic ideals, W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America was, for me, a revelatory model of engaged scholarship that raised fundamental issues about American life, both theoretical and historical and empirical, in ways that certainly weren't likely to influence policy debates directly in the 1930s when he wrote it. The book got very little immediate recognition, but it did over time very much help reshape the environment of ideas in which we work. Even though I have a lot of objections to John Rawls' theory of justice, it reinvigorated a lot of political philosophy and inquiries into inequality, channeling the spirit of the 1960s civil rights movement and anti-poverty movement in ways that suggested promising intellectual directions. Some I think are dead ends, but some are very promising, and in ways that ultimately informed policy debates. But I'd have to say, coming back to political science, the empirical works like V.O. Key's Southern Politics, which again was not likely immediately to affect policy positions in the Jim Crow South, but did much to illuminate its politics. My own thesis advisor, Judith Shklar's work on the liberalism of fear, which was definitely academic inquiry, but it also played continues to play a significant role in thinking about how you combat authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Those are all examples of works that I think are beneficial in the ways that I've tried to emulate to some extent.
That, let's see, I'll be a little provocative here, that the sort of holy trinity of race, class, and gender, like that we've somehow fallen into conventional categories, ways of thinking about justice and injustice, and that we're just kind of repeating a Kant from, decades gone by? Like, are there new fields out there that have some sort of liberatory potential or something that we're just not seeing because we're stuck in these very established categories?
Well, though I think the questions of race, class, and gender remain tremendously important as deeply entrenched systems of inequality and deeply interconnected systems of inequality that we need to understand better and that we need to address more constructively in our politics. I fully agree with you that sometimes there can be a predictable mechanical quality to race, class, gender work in which we seem to be replaying old debates and reasserting established positions without making much headway and progress. I have been interested in recent years in a couple of connected things that I think don't lead us to abandon concerns with race, class, and gender by any means, but do push our concerns about how we achieve justice, how we construct better political communities further. And one is trying to think about whether nation states, which came to dominate the world only in the second half of the 20th century, whether that form of political community is best in theory or sustainable in practice. If we should structure our political communities substantially differently, what would that look like? We had a brief period where people were saying the nation state is dying. That was always exaggerated. Now we have resurgent nationalisms, often authoritarian nationalisms, and but those are occurring in part precisely because nation states, while far from disappearing, are being successfully contested both at transnational and subnational levels in many ways. And the whole international nation-state system is a vast structure of inequality in which life opportunities are far better if you're born in some places than others. So there are quite fundamental questions about justice and about ways to provide greater opportunities for broader human flourishing that lead us to rethink the structure, basic structure of our political communities globally. I've also been arguing that while academics, in addition to the mantra of race, class, gender, also adopt a mantra of social construction, the reality is that we still have a politics in which people on the left, as well as the right, take certain identities as authentic, real, even if it's strategic essentialism. Often it reflects emotionally an essentialist embrace of some identities as who we truly are. And I've been making the suggestion, it may be a radical suggestion, that we have to accept that all human identities are to some degree politically constructed. I think to a significant degree politically constructed. That doesn't mean they're inauthentic. That doesn't mean they're not valuable. It does mean that we need to recognize much more pervasively how our political institutions and societies are crafting and favoring some identities over others, and we need to pursue those topics much more extensively, I believe, in our empirical work. A lot of the work on the politics identity has been theoretical, usefully questioning prevailing assumptions. But empirical work that takes the construction of a whole variety of human identities as our dependent variable is something that we think politics helps create. We haven't done that very much. And again, while that encompasses a race, class, gender agenda, it suggests a broader agenda that I think we need if we're really to come to grips with all the barriers and the opportunities to promote
I was going to ask, maybe humorously, are you anti-identitarian?
I don't think we have that option. We can't not have identities. The only question is what identities we want to craft and embrace, and what identities we can craft and embrace, since we don't have.
Let me return to the topic of finding topics. When you finished a project and you're starting to think about the next one, what's going through your head? What are you looking for? And how do you decide from the numerous things that you could devote your time to what are most worthwhile?
Inevitably, multiple factors come into play. I continue to be influenced by broader world political developments that may concern me. There's a critical response to what I've done that often makes me think that I haven't said enough about some things. I haven't said some things clearly. I may be wrong about some things, and I need to address those topics. It's also true that generally when I finish a project, the conclusions I've reached raise new questions in my mind, and they often haunt me until I start working on them. After I finished Civic Ideals, I found myself wondering, well, look, I've got all this empirical evidence that these kinds of racial conceptions of American identity, nativist conceptions, patriarchal conceptions, certain religious conceptions have been very powerful in American history, more than many academic accounts have explained. But why is that so? I had done some work on theorizing that in my opening to Civic Ideals, but I wasn't satisfied that I had gone far enough with trying to understand why human beings construct societies relying heavily on doctrines that simply aren't true, as in the case of claims of a small number of races hierarchically ranked, counts of gender differences, etc. And they use these accounts in constructing the institutions of society. They do it in ways that involve what look like, to me, many injustices and indefensible systems of inequality. And, so just why do we do that to ourselves and each other? And there's some easy answers. It's all about power. It's all about money. But I didn't think those answers were adequate. They were certainly true to an extent, but I didn't think they were adequate. And I found my thinking driven in a more theoretical direction that led me to write the book Stories of Peoplehood, in which I tried to understand the kind of narratives of political identity and membership that people embrace, people develop and advance and embrace. And I tried to understand why certain kinds of stories had the appeal and force that they clearly do. And that work in turn raised further questions that have set a lot of my intellectual.
It sounds like for you, one project sort of leads to another, and that if you were to write your intellectual autobiography, you could find that thread, that connecting thread.
Absolutely, I think in fact it's sort of embarrassingly obvious how one thing led to another in my career in ways that might make me look pretty predictable and unimaginative. But nonetheless, there is a thread.
What do you, I'm going to change the subject a little bit. What do you tell your doctoral students who are looking around for topics for their dissertation and having a hard time? Do you have advice that others, might benefit from?
I do. I have at this point a pretty established way of conducting those discussions that doesn't always work, but often it does work. I tell them that they should engage in a process of systematic introspection. And my thesis advisor suggested something like this to me, and then I've elaborated it over the years. I say that they should sit and think about what in the world of politics or the world of political science or both, what gets their adrenaline flowing, either in excitement or in outrage. What are topics that they really feel their pulse quickening when they start thinking about them, and then ask themselves, why do they feel that way? Why are they reacting that way? Ask themselves specifically, what do you think that many people believe about this topic that's wrong, and what do you think is right? Or what do you think about this topic many people fail to see that you think is true and important for good or ill? And then I say, to write down several such things, and then look at them and ask yourself, if this upsets me, if this excites me, for this reason, is there a kind of claim there about what's true or what's good or bad in the world? And just what is that claim that I am attracted to, that I think is probably right? And then you say, if that claim is right, what would count as evidence for and particularly against that claim? What would show that, what I think is true or good or bad enough that I get excited about it? What would make me rethink that, as well as what would provide support for that claim that might persuade others? And at that point, you have 2 or 3 potential dissertation topics. You have some preliminary strategies for researching them, for systematically compiling evidence for or against your tentative claims. And then I say, go and work on 2 or 3 of those for a little bit and see which one seems to have some traction, as well as which one continues to excite you, hold your interest,
And,
and we go with that. One of the benefits of this, by the way, is that I learn tremendously from my graduate students when they develop their own interests in these ways instead of just
and do you
following
ever
mine.
have the concern that people will start, writing legal briefs, essentially finding all the evidence that supports their claim and ignoring counter evidence or whatever? Or do you see?
Well, that's my role to make sure that doesn't happen. Again, the emphasis has to be you have to think hard about what counts as evidence against your claim, and you have to be able to show that you've done everything you can honestly to locate and assess that evidence. And if you haven't, you are failing in your project. And as the advisor, I will keep pushing. What about this? Have you looked at that? How do you respond to this? And so I have not really had the problem that people have ended up writing briefs, I believe. I do sometimes have to push hard to get them to take seriously the tasks of finding counter evidence and answering objections. But really, that's because they're actually a little bit afraid that they'll have to give up their view if they look at the evidence. And when they begin to realize that, well, they may need to modify it some, but there is some kernel of truth there that they can hold on to, and that they can now argue for it more confidently, they often find that an empowering and exciting experience. And they get into making sure that they've identified every possible bit of counter evidence.
Well, that sounds like a rigorous process. Let me turn our attention from graduate students to our colleagues, and without naming names, let's posit that some of our colleagues are extremely productive and creative and sort of jump from one mountain peak to the next, and others seem a little bit stuck. And I wonder if you could speculate a little bit on how it is that some people manage to retain that curiosity, creativity, productivity, whatever it is, over a long career, and others kind of lose their way, or are we all sort of eternal graduate students struggling for our next project? And why are some people seemingly more successful at that than others?
Well, I'd stress that there is not only one way ahead of us. It isn't necessarily a sign that something's gone wrong in a career if a person finds that while they were highly motivated to do research at a certain point in their life, later on they want more hands-on activities like academic administration or perhaps consulting in with governments, with NGOs, or perhaps investing still more heavily in their teaching. I don't think it's true that the only kind of trajectory for an academic career that is honorable or desirable is to continue to generate major research projects. There are many ways to contribute in the world, and people have different personalities, different tastes and talents, and they evolve over time. So I don't necessarily regard it that someone's lost their way if they, end up being provost at a university, as some of my colleagues and students have done, rather than continuing to be a research scholar. At the same time, I do worry that that academic careers today are shaped by market pressures that in certain ways spur excellence, but not all forms of excellence. That some kinds of work are more likely to get published and recognized than others, and that people whose intellectual interests and talents lead them to do different sorts of work, they can get discouraged. So they may fall off a heavily research-oriented track, not so much because they choose to, but because they feel it isn't, that their kind of work isn't having the recognition or impact that they hope for. To some degree that's unavoidable, but I think that we as a profession can do a better job of recognizing and rewarding a great variety
so what is that
kinds
work
of
that you
valuable
feel
work.
is undervalued, under-rewarded, but nonetheless valuable?
Well, in recent decades in particular, we treat rigorous testing of causality as our primary goal in political science, to some degree the social sciences more generally. And that is an essential goal. That should be a very large part of our disciplinary endeavor. I fully agree. But there's always the issue of whether we are testing causal relations that are really the most important or significant ones for understanding things about the world that we wish to understand. And how do we determine that they are? We need a variety of different kinds of inquiries to gain understanding of what sorts of causal relations might matter, not just for shaping the outcome of the dependent variable, but for really reflecting things happening in the world that are of great importance politically and for human lives. So we need some kinds of research that are more ethnographic, in which by interacting with different communities of human beings, researchers develop inductively new ideas about what sorts of relationships may be significant and may be worth testing. We need research that helps us imagine alternative arrangements to existing arrangements, and as political theorists sometimes do, as more qualitative researchers often do. Testing causality is not a way to imagine alternative institutional structures or forms of political community, et cetera. I think in general, we have to be wary of simply testing causal relationships that are deemed important by academic theories within our discipline. We should do that, but we should also try to engage with various communities and see what's on other people's minds and what they think are important, and try to make sure that their senses of what the most important questions in their world
Good. Well,
are.
this
Those are
segues nicely
questions that
into
we
my
also try to
penultimate
answer.
question. Are there, in your view, unexplored areas of research? Are there areas that are ripe for discovery or rediscovery? And you're welcome to talk about your own work in progress if you like.
Well, I think I've already touched on things that I think we need to address more. In their book, Democracy for Realists, Chris Aiken and Larry Bartels say something I agree with, which is that while we have a lot of talk about identity politics, we don't have a lot of empirical behavioral work that really looks at how political identities are constructed. Indeed, we've tended to leave that to the sociologists through our mantra of social construction, and that often leads attention away from how specifically political policies and institutions shape people's senses of identity and purpose. And that is something that I think the field needs to do more. I do, although I celebrate a pluralistic discipline in which lots of people do different kinds of work, I think it's just an undeniable fact that all political behavior takes place within human history. And so I think it is important always to raise the question of whether we are seeing political behaviors that are products of particular historical sequences that take place in certain times and places and aren't necessarily timeless regularities of political behavior. There is so I think I think we need to pay more attention to how politics constructs identity. I think we need to have an even greater presence of historically aware work in political science. And I have other concerns, but these do reflect my own interests and emphases. And one thing I definitely don't think is that the field of political science should be confined to my interests and emphases. I think we need lots of different perspectives and lots of different approaches. You asked the question, what do you think should be done more? And I'm giving you an answer.
Right. Good.
It should not be heard as an answer.
This is my last question. Is there anything we're missing in our quest to understand the process of exploratory research and finding topics and so forth? Anything important that we haven't touched on in our discussion here or in the survey that you took?
Well, I'd like to be still more explicit that number one, this whole subject matter you've raised, how we come up with ideas for research, is tremendously important. It is fundamental to doing good research, and we don't pay enough attention to it. So you're making a contribution that I greatly appreciate in raising and exploring this question. And I do feel that too much of the discipline responds to it very differently than I do. Again, different approaches, different responses are valuable in a pluralistic discipline. But too often, I think younger scholars are told that the way that you come up with a research question is to read the journals, read the recently influential and widely cited articles and debates in those journals, and try to identify gaps in that discussion, and then try to be the first to fill that gap with an empirical finding that helps complete a picture or helps settle a dispute. Now, we do need some of that work, but the view that your work is irrelevant if you're not filling gaps in the disciplinary debates, that unduly constricts the range of questions that political scientists explore, and it runs a real risk that there will be very important questions that political scientists simply don't address because they're not already visible in the disciplinary literature and debates. They're not clearly gaps in existing lines of research. I think we always need to keep one eye firmly on the broader political world and not simply on our internal debates in deciding
really good
what topics
words
we
of
want
advice.
to pursue.
Rogers, thank you again. This has been invaluable for Jay and myself, and I hope for others who listen to this interview.